30 million people died. And the man who set it all in motion went to bed each night convinced he was winning. June 22nd, 1941. Before breakfast, 3 million men crossed a border that barely existed on most maps. No formal declaration. No warning. Just the sound of artillery splitting the pre-dawn sky across a 2,900-kilometer front. It was the largest invasion in human history. And for the first 6 months it worked. The Wehrmacht swept east like something mechanical. Precise. Merciless. Cities fell in days. Soviet divisions evaporated by the hundreds. The Red Army lost more men in the opening weeks than most nations fielded in total. German panzer groups didn't just advance. They swallowed entire armies whole, encircling them in pockets so vast that the trapped men couldn't even see their own walls. This was not a close fight. By October 1941, Germany had captured or killed over 3 million Soviet soldiers. Think about that number. 3 million. That's roughly the entire population of Chicago. Soldiers, not civilians, gone in under 5 months. The Germans took so many prisoners that they didn't know what to do with them. Men were left in open fields to die. Not because of cruelty alone, but because the German logistical system had no plan for prisoners at that scale. There was no plan, because no one thought anyone would survive long enough to surrender. This was the gamble. Germany's entire war in the East rested on one assumption: the Soviet state would collapse. Hit it hard enough, fast enough, and the whole rotten structure, as Hitler put it, would crumble. He told his generals it was like kicking in a rotten door. The door didn't crumble. But before we get to the collapse, we need to understand the lie that made it inevitable. And that lie wasn't born in Russia. It was born in France. In 6 weeks that rewired how Germany thought about war entirely. But here's what makes this story genuinely disturbing. Germany was right about almost everything tactically. Their officers were better trained. Their doctrine was more advanced. Their combined arms coordination was a generation ahead of Soviet practice. In direct engagement after direct engagement in 1941, German units achieved kill ratios that military historians still struggle to explain. And they still lost. Not slowly, not gracefully. The Eastern Front became a wound that bled Germany dry over 4 years, consuming more German lives than every other front combined. Roughly 3 million German soldiers would eventually die there. Soviet military deaths reached approximately 9 million. Those two numbers together represent a scale of violence that has no comparison in recorded human history. This isn't a story about weather. It isn't a story about Hitler being a bad general, though he was. It isn't even a story about Soviet bravery, though that was real and documented and worth its own script. This is a story about a machine that defeated itself. Germany's failure in the East was structural. It was ideological. It was baked into the plan before a single tank crossed the border. The Wehrmacht won nearly every battle in 1941. They dominated. They encircled. They annihilated. And they still ran out of war. Corporal Hans Roth of the 7th Panzer Division wrote in his diary on June 19, 1941, 3 days before the invasion, "Hooray! The greatest battle of all time begins the day after tomorrow." He was young. He was certain. He was surrounded by men who felt the same cold electric confidence. Very soon, the diary changed. The question historians still argue over, and the question this video is really about, is not whether Germany could have won. Most serious scholars say no. The question is, at what exact moment did the outcome become inevitable? Was it a strategic error? A supply chain failure? An ideological blindness so total it couldn't be corrected in time? Or was it something stranger? Something that runs deeper? The answer begins not in Russia. It begins in France. In the summer of 1940. In 6 weeks that created a lie so convincing that Germany's entire high command believed it without question. France fell in 46 days. Not weeks. Not months. Days. The British evacuated at Dunkirk. The French government collapsed. One of the most powerful military forces in Europe simply stopped. It was the fastest defeat of a major power in modern history. And it taught Germany exactly the wrong lesson. The lesson Germany took from France was this: modern states are fragile. Hit them fast, destroy their military in the field, and the political structure caves. No long war. No grinding attrition. Just speed, shock, and collapse. It worked in Poland. It worked in Norway. It worked in France. It worked in Yugoslavia in 11 days. Every victory confirmed the theory. But France was not the Soviet Union. And the Wehrmacht's leadership either couldn't see that difference or refused to. And what happened next is what makes this truly maddening, because Germany didn't stumble into ignorance. They had the intelligence reports. They had the numbers. They knew. And they attacked anyway. Here is the mystery that serious historians keep returning to. Germany had intelligence. Real intelligence. They had reports on Soviet industrial capacity. They had defectors. They had aerial reconnaissance showing factory complexes east of the Ural Mountains. Complexes so far from the front line that no German army could ever reach them. Factories that would keep producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition even if Germany captured Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev simultaneously. The German army's own logistics planners estimated that the campaign required resupply lines stretching over 1,600 kilometers. That number alone should have ended the conversation. For context, that's roughly the distance from London to Warsaw. Moving fuel, ammunition, and food for 3 million men across that distance, with limited railways and roads that turned to mud in rain, was not a solved problem. It was an ignored one. Historian David Stahel, who spent years in German military archives, found something striking. The internal documents of Germany's panzer groups, the armored spearheads the entire Blitzkrieg depended on, showed mechanical breakdown rates that were catastrophic from the opening weeks. By August 1941, some panzer divisions were operating at less than half their vehicle strength. Not from enemy fire. From where? From roads that weren't roads. From a supply system that couldn't keep pace with the advance it was supposed to support. The machine was consuming itself. Moving forward. Breaking down. Moving forward again on fumes. So why did the German High Command proceed? Some historians, like Rolf-Dieter Müller, argue the economic pressures were real. Germany needed Soviet oil and grain to sustain a long war against Britain and potentially America. The invasion wasn't irrational, it was desperate. Others, like Christian Hartmann, point to institutional failures in German military planning culture, where operational brilliance consistently masked strategic blindness. Both are probably right. But underneath those arguments sits something harder to quantify. Nazi ideology didn't just shape the politics of the regime. It shaped the intelligence assessments. It shaped what officers were willing to report upward. A system that treated Slavic peoples as racially inferior could not simultaneously produce accurate threat assessments about Slavic military capacity. The ideology poisoned the data. German planners estimated the Red Army had approximately 200 frontline divisions. The actual number exceeded 300. That gap, 100 divisions, isn't a rounding error. It's an entire army. It means Germany went to war against an enemy it fundamentally did not understand, armed with assumptions built more from prejudice than from evidence. And yet the early battles were real. The victories were genuine. The encirclements at Minsk, Kiev, and Vyazma swallowed entire Soviet army groups. So the question that opens like a crack in the floor is this. If Germany was so wrong about the Soviet Union, why did it take 4 years to lose? The plan had 3 arrows on a map. Army Group North, Army Group Center, Army Group South, each driving east simultaneously. North toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, south toward Kiev and the Ukrainian breadbasket. The idea was clean on paper. Destroy the Red Army before it could retreat. Force a decisive engagement near the border. Win in 12 weeks. It was called Operation Barbarossa, named after a medieval German emperor who drowned before reaching his destination. The naming was not examined for omens. The strategic logic had a kernel of genuine military sense. Napoleon had marched straight for Moscow in 1812 and found a city that didn't surrender even when burned. Germany's planners believed the mistake wasn't the invasion, it was the single axis of advance. Spread the attack. Force the Soviets to defend everywhere. Prevent them from concentrating. On paper, reasonable. In practice, It created three undersupplied armies racing toward three different objectives across a front so wide that the flanks couldn't support each other. The Wehrmacht was not designed for this. Blitzkrieg worked in confined spaces. France had good roads, short distances, and a command structure that froze under pressure. The Soviet Union had almost no paved roads outside major cities, distances that mocked European military thinking, and a command structure that, after initial paralysis, proved capable of learning faster than anyone anticipated. The logistics tell the story most honestly. The German army in 1941 relied on approximately 600,000 horses for transport. Not trucks. Horses. The motorized image of the Wehrmacht, panzers, half-tracks, motorcycles, was real but partial. Behind the armored spearhead, the supply chain ran on animals and boots. When those horses encountered Soviet mud in autumn, the advance didn't slow. It stopped. There is a term for it. Rasputitsa, the Russian word for the twice-yearly mud season when frozen ground thaws and roads become impassable. It happens in spring and autumn. Germany's planners knew about it. It appeared in their own geographic assessments. They scheduled the invasion anyway. Barbarossa was originally planned for May 15, 1941. It was delayed 5 weeks by the unexpected need to first invade Yugoslavia and Greece, after Mussolini's failed campaign destabilized the Balkans. Those 5 weeks pushed the launch to June 22nd, which pushed the advance into autumn mud earlier than planned, which pushed the final drive toward Moscow into the Soviet winter. 5 weeks. The entire trajectory of the war shifted by 5 weeks. But here is where the standard narrative requires a correction. Many popular accounts treat the weather as the primary cause of German failure. This is too simple, and serious military historians reject it. Germany's deeper problem was not the cold. It was that the cold arrived before the campaign's objectives were complete, because the campaign's objectives were impossible to complete in the time allocated, regardless of weather. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, wrote in his diary on August 11, 1941, "Still summer, still dry, that the vastness of Russia was swallowing German strength. New Soviet formations kept appearing. The front kept expanding. The math kept not working. The strategy had assumed a finite enemy. The enemy was not finite." By late July 1941, a critical argument erupted inside German high command. Army Group Center's panzers had reached Smolensk. Moscow was within striking distance, roughly 400 kilometers. General Heinz Guderian, commanding the fastest armored force in the world, wanted to drive straight for the Soviet capital. His logic was sound. Moscow was the nerve center of the Soviet rail network. Capturing it would sever supply lines across the entire country. Hitler overruled him. Instead, he diverted Guderian's panzers south to assist in the encirclement of Kiev. It was, tactically, a spectacular success. The Kiev encirclement in September 1941 captured approximately 650,000 Soviet soldiers in a single operation. It remains one of the largest encirclements in military history. It also cost Germany 6 weeks. 6 weeks in which Moscow was left ungrasped. 6 weeks in which Soviet defenders dug new lines. 6 weeks in which Siberian divisions, trained for winter, equipped for cold, began moving west by rail toward the capital. Put yourself in that room in July 1941. Your fastest tanks are 400 kilometers from Moscow. Your generals are telling you, push now, end it now. But your southern flank is exposed, and there are 650,000 enemy soldiers you could encircle instead. The encirclement is real. The Moscow gamble might not pay off. What do you choose? And here's the part that should make you genuinely uncomfortable. Whatever you chose, you'd have been choosing between two disasters. There was no clean option left. The plan had already consumed it. Some historians, particularly John Erickson, argue the Moscow diversion was strategically fatal. Others, like Evan Maudsley, suggest Moscow's capture would not have ended. Soviet resistance, that the Soviet state had already begun relocating government functions east, and Stalin had no intention of surrendering regardless. The debate matters because it reframes the entire question. Germany's failure wasn't a single error. It was a cascade. Each decision that seemed rational in isolation fed a system that was, structurally, devouring its own margin for error. There was no margin left by the time winter came. And underneath all the strategy, the maps, the arrows, the encirclements, a simpler process was already underway. The German soldier on the ground was being asked to fight at the end of a supply line that couldn't sustain him. By October 1941, frontline German infantrymen were receiving approximately one-third of their required daily ammunition supply. One-third. Imagine running a factory at one-third capacity and being told to double production. That is what the Wehrmacht was being asked to do at the gates of Moscow. The plan was breaking. Quietly, before the first snowflake fell. December 5, 1941. The temperature outside Moscow dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius. German soldiers were wearing summer uniforms. Not because supply lines had failed that week. Because the campaign was supposed to be over by September. Nobody had planned for a winter that the army was still standing in. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties. Let that settle. More men were being destroyed by the weather than by Soviet bullets. Rifle bolts froze. Engine oil congealed. Artillery pieces couldn't fire because the recoil mechanisms had solidified. The most technically advanced army in Europe was being neutralized by temperature. But the cold was not the shock event. The shock event was what came next. On December 6, 1941, the Red Army counterattacked. Not a desperate last stand. Not a disorganized surge from trapped men with nowhere to go. A coordinated, large-scale offensive along the entire Moscow front, executed by fresh divisions that the German intelligence apparatus had not known existed. These were the Siberian divisions. Stalin had gambled everything on a single intelligence report. His spy in Tokyo, Richard Sword, had confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. That meant the Soviet Far Eastern Army, battle-hardened, winter-trained, properly equipped, could be pulled from the Mongolian border and redeployed west by rail. Quietly, quickly, without German reconnaissance detecting the full scale of the transfer. Approximately 18 divisions and 1,700 tanks arrived near Moscow in the weeks before the counterattack. These soldiers had white winter camouflage. Their weapons were lubricated with cold weather oil. Their boots were felt-lined. The Germans facing them had none of those things. General Gotthard Heinrichsay, a corps commander who had fought in both world wars, wrote to his wife on December 16, 1941, 10 days into the Soviet counteroffensive, with a candor that his rank normally would have forbidden. In the entire First World War, I was never in a situation such as we are experiencing now. We walked away on snow and ice just like Napoleon in his time. The losses are similar. Apathy among the personnel is growing. The state of the troops cannot be called anything but deplorable. A decorated general. A career soldier. Comparing his army to Napoleon's frozen retreat. He was not being dramatic. He was being precise. The German line outside Moscow didn't just stop. It broke in multiple places simultaneously. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht retreated not by choice but by collapse. Units lost cohesion. Officers lost contact with their flanks. The clean arrows on the maps dissolved into something that looked, from above, like a slow unraveling. Hitler's response was to issue his infamous "Stand Fast" order. No retreating. Hold every position. He later claimed this decision saved the army from total disintegration, a claim some military historians partially accept, noting that ordered retreat in those conditions might have become rout. What the order also did was leave men in exposed positions without adequate shelter, supplies, or reinforcement. Holding ground that had no strategic value. Dying in place because movement itself had been forbidden. Operation Barbarossa officially ended on December 5, 1941. It had not achieved a single one of its primary objectives. Leningrad was besieged but not captured. Moscow was not reached. The Soviet state had not collapsed. The Red Army, despite losing millions of men, was counterattacking with forces Germany hadn't known existed. The war Germany had planned, the short war, the clean war, the war that ended before winter, was over. The war that would actually kill Germany had just begun. And yet, in 1942, Germany attacked again. Deeper, faster, toward a city on the Volga that would give this entire war its defining image. The question isn't why they attacked. The question is what they believed had changed. The answer is Nothing. Nothing had changed at all. There is a specific kind of damage that happens to a soldier who wins every battle and still finds himself losing. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Small things first. The road that was supposed to end at a supply depot that isn't there. The reinforcements that were promised but arrive as a fraction of what was requested. The orders that bear no relationship to the ground in front of you. Then the larger things. The enemy that was supposed to be broken keeps appearing. Fresh, equipped, angrier than before. German soldiers in 1941 entered the Soviet Union with a specific psychological contract. It was unwritten but universally understood. This will be fast. We have done this before. We are the best army in the world, and the enemy is racially and militarily inferior. Be home by Christmas. That contract was voided in the mud, then in the frost, then in the counterattack. Corporal Hans Roth, who had written "Hooray" in his diary 3 days before the invasion, recorded something different by late 1941. The tone had shifted from certainty to endurance, from confidence to something quieter and harder to name. He had watched men freeze. He had watched encirclements that were supposed to end resistance produce only more resistance. The diary didn't break dramatically. It just stopped sounding like the same person. That transformation, confidence curdling into grim mechanical survival, ran through the entire Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. The German military system was built on a doctrine called Auftragstaktik, mission-based tactics. Officers at every level were trained to use independent judgment, to improvise, to act without waiting for orders when the situation demanded it. It was the philosophical engine behind Blitzkrieg's success. But Auftragstaktik requires one precondition. The officer making independent decisions must have an accurate picture of the operational reality around him. By late 1941, that picture had been systematically distorted. Reporting bad news upward in the Wehrmacht had become professionally dangerous. Hitler's emotional responses to setbacks were well documented within the officer corps. Commanders learned to soften assessments, to frame retreats as tactical repositioning, to report ammunition shortages as temporary. The system that depended on honest information to function now received managed information. A machine running on bad data doesn't fail loudly. It fails quietly, making decisions that seem locally rational but are systematically wrong. The psychological damage extended beyond individual soldiers. It infected the institution. By December 1941, German Army Group Center had suffered approximately 400,000 casualties since June. That is nearly a quarter of its original strength in 6 months. For a force that had no replacement pipeline designed for attrition at that scale, those numbers represented something institutional, not just human. Experienced NCOs, trained tank crews, officers who understood combined arms coordination. Gone. Each one replaced, when replaced at all, by someone less trained, less experienced, less capable of executing the precise, fast-moving doctrine that had made the Wehrmacht dangerous in the first place. The army that crossed the border in June 1941 no longer existed by January 1942. A different army wore the same uniforms, carried the same weapons, fought under the same flags. But it was not the same instrument. And the Soviet Union, which had absorbed losses that would have ended most states, was becoming something different too. Harder, more coherent, angrier in a way that didn't diminish with time but intensified. Two armies were transforming simultaneously, one downward, one upward. The trajectory had been set. What remained was the distance it had to travel before the conclusion became visible to everyone still alive to see it. The question no one inside the Wehrmacht could yet bring themselves to ask plainly was the one that mattered most. If we couldn't win when we were strongest, what happens now? 1942 should not have been possible. Germany had just failed the largest military operation in human history. Its panzer forces were depleted. Its infantry divisions were under strength. Its supply system had demonstrated, in brutal clarity, that it could not sustain a three-front offensive across Soviet distances. And yet, in the summer of 1942, Germany attacked again. Not cautiously, not defensively. Another massive offensive. Deeper into Soviet territory. toward the Caucasus oil fields and a city on the Volga River that would become the most fought-over piece of urban ground in human history. Stalingrad. The decision to attack in 1942 is where historians divide most sharply. Some, like Adam Tooze in his Economic History of the Nazi War Machine, argue the attack was economically rational. Germany genuinely needed Soviet oil to sustain the war. Without the Caucasus fields, the Wehrmacht would eventually run dry. The offensive wasn't aggression. It was desperation wearing aggression's clothing. Others argue it was the terminal expression of a strategic culture that had no answer to failure except acceleration. If the plan didn't work, the plan needed to be bigger, faster. Well, both interpretations contain truth, and together they describe something more disturbing than either alone. A state making rational calculations inside an irrational framework. Each individual decision defensible. The overall trajectory suicidal. Case Blue, the 1942 summer offensive, began with genuine success. German forces swept across the southern steppe with speed that briefly recalled the summer of 1941. Soviet formations, still recovering, gave ground. The Don River was crossed. The Caucasus advance made early progress. For a few weeks in the summer heat, the old confidence flickered back. Then the front stretched again. Army Group South had been split into two. Army Group A driving south toward the Caucasus. Army Group B driving east toward Stalingrad. The two forces were moving in diverging directions, their flanks increasingly exposed, their supply lines increasingly tenuous. The distance between them grew. The gap between them filled with risk. Hitler's attention fixed on Stalingrad with an intensity that overrode operational logic. The city bore Stalin's name. Capturing it had symbolic weight that Hitler elevated above strategic calculation. His generals wanted to bypass it, secure the flanks, push to the Volga, move on. Hitler wanted the city itself. The city itself was a trap. Urban combat neutralizes armor. It eliminates the open ground maneuver that made German doctrine lethal. It reduces warfare to building by building, floor by floor, room by room attrition. Every advantage the Wehrmacht possessed was negated the moment it entered Stalingrad streets. Soviet General Vasily Chukov, commanding the 62nd Army defending the city, understood this with cold precision. He ordered his men to close the distance with German attackers, to hug them, to fight so close that German air support and artillery couldn't fire without hitting their own men. It became known as embracing the enemy. It worked. The battle for Stalingrad consumed the German 6th Army, one of the most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht, through the autumn of 1942. While the 6th Army bled inside the city, its flanks were held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian allied forces. These were not weak armies by general standards, but they were not equipped for the Eastern Front. They had insufficient anti-tank weapons, insufficient artillery, insufficient reserves. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus. Two massive armored thrusts, one from the north and one from the south, drove directly into those Allied flanks. The flanks collapsed within days. The two Soviet spearheads met at the town of Kalach on November 23, 1942. The German 6th Army, approximately 300,000 men, was encircled. The Soviets had done to Germany what Germany had done to the Soviet Union in 1941. Encirclement. Destruction in detail. The same operational concept, executed with the precision of an army that had spent 18 months studying, under live fire, exactly how it worked. Hermann Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air. It required delivering approximately 500 tons of supplies per day to sustain the 6th Army. The Luftwaffe managed an average of roughly 100 tons per day. 1/5 of what was needed. 1/5. That is the equivalent of offering a drowning man a bottle cap to float on. The math was not close. It was not even in the same category of possibility. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted a relief operation in December 1942. His forces came within approximately 50 kilometers of the encircled army before being stopped. 50 kilometers. Close enough that trapped men could sometimes hear the distant artillery of their would-be rescuers. Not close enough. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout from within the encirclement. The Sixth Army was ordered to hold its position and wait for relief that could not reach it. By January 1943, men were dying of starvation and cold at rates that consumed entire battalions per week. On February 2, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the remnants of the Sixth Army. Approximately 91,000 men marched into Soviet captivity. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would survive to return to Germany after the war. The rest died in camps, of cold, of hunger, of diseases that adequate food would have prevented. The announcement reached the German public with a carefully managed delay. When it came, it landed differently than previous setbacks. The population had been told Stalingrad was a fortress of resistance. Suddenly, it was a graveyard. Hermann Göring made a promise he could not keep, and 300,000 men paid for it with their lives. He stood in front of Hitler and guaranteed an airlift that his own logistics officers privately told him was impossible. He knew. He promised anyway, because telling Hitler what Hitler wanted to hear was how you survived in that system. After Stalingrad, Göring faced no firing squad, no criminal tribunal. He retreated to his estate, Hall, filled with stolen art looted from occupied Europe, and continued hosting banquets while the families of the Sixth Army received telegrams. The soldiers who had trusted his promise died in open fields in -30-degree temperatures, too weak to dig shelters, eating boot leather to stay alive. Göring was captured in 1945, tried at Nuremberg, and cheated the hangman by swallowing a cyanide capsule the night before his execution. He died in a bed. Most of his Sixth Army died in the snow. But Stalingrad, catastrophic as it was, is still not the full answer to why Germany failed. It is the most visible symptom. The underlying disease had been progressing since the opening weeks of Barbarossa. The disease was this: Germany was fighting a war of annihilation against an enemy that absorbed annihilation and continued to function. Every assumption about Soviet fragility, political, military, psychological, had proven false. The Soviet state did not collapse when its armies were destroyed. It rebuilt them. It did not negotiate when its cities were encircled. It held them. It did not surrender when its capital was threatened. It counterattacked. Soviet industrial output, relocated east of the Urals beyond German reach, produced staggering quantities of war material throughout the conflict. In 1942 alone, Soviet factories produced approximately 24,000 tanks. Germany produced approximately 9,000 that year. That ratio, nearly 3 Soviet tanks for every 1 German tank, is not a gap that battlefield tactical excellence can bridge indefinitely. Superior training, superior crew quality, superior doctrine all matter. But they have limits. Quantity has a quality of its own, as the Eastern Front demonstrated with statistical brutality. The Wehrmacht was not just fighting the Red Army. It was fighting Soviet geography, Soviet industry, Soviet population reserves, and a Soviet political system that, whatever its crimes, proved capable of mobilizing national resistance at a scale that no German planner had seriously modeled. Germany had kicked the door. The door had held. And behind it, something had been woken up that would not stop until Berlin itself was rubble. Summer 1944. Germany was no longer advancing anywhere on the Eastern Front. The question had shifted from conquest to survival. The language in Wehrmacht operational orders changed. Elastic defense. Tactical withdrawal. Shortening the line. These were phrases designed to describe retreat without using the word. The word was retreat. On June 23, 1944, one day after the 3rd anniversary of Barbarossa, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration. It was named after a Russian general killed fighting Napoleon. The naming was deliberate. The symmetry was intentional. What followed was, by most military metrics, the greatest single defeat in German military history. Greater than Stalingrad. Greater than anything on the Western Front. In 5 weeks, Soviet forces destroyed Army Group Center almost entirely. 17 German divisions were encircled and annihilated. Approximately 350,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The front line moved 600 kilometers westward. The Wehrmacht lost more men in those 5 weeks than America lost in the entire Second World War. The Soviets had become everything Germany thought they never could be. Their operational planning was now sophisticated, deceptive, and precisely coordinated. They had mastered the art of maskirovka, military deception, concentrating forces in secret, disguising intentions, attacking where German intelligence had assessed them weakest. The army that had frozen in confusion in 1941 was now executing operations of a complexity that matched and in some respects exceeded German doctrine at its peak. They had learned from defeat. Systematically, Germany had not equivalently adapted. Its doctrine remained oriented toward offensive maneuver in conditions that no longer existed. Its officer corps had been hollowed out by 4 years of attrition and by Hitler's systematic removal of generals who delivered unwelcome assessments. The institutional knowledge that had made the Wehrmacht dangerous in 1941 had been bled out and not replaced. By late 1944, the average age of German frontline infantry replacements was falling. Boys were being processed through abbreviated training cycles and fed into a front that consumed them faster than the system could produce them. The professional army that had crossed into the Soviet Union had been replaced again, and replaced once more. Each replacement cycle produced a diminished version. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was receiving substantial material support through the Allied Lend-Lease program. Approximately 400,000 trucks and jeeps arrived from America, solving precisely the mobility problem that had plagued Soviet operations in 1941 and 1942. Food, locomotives, communication equipment, the material underpinning of modern warfare, delivered in quantities that freed Soviet industry to concentrate on tanks and artillery. Germany had no equivalent external supply. It was contracting. The Soviet Union was expanding. The arithmetic had only one possible result. What is striking, and what many popular accounts miss, is how long German units continued to fight effectively even during the collapse. Individual divisions maintained tactical coherence and inflicted severe casualties on attackers well into 1945. The Wehrmacht did not disintegrate into chaos. It was ground down, slowly, methodically, by an enemy that had accepted the logic of attrition and built a machine specifically designed to win it. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of the Eastern Front's final chapter. The German soldier did not stop being capable. The German army did not stop being dangerous. It simply ran out of everything required to translate capability into outcome. Men, fuel, ammunition, time. The Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag in Berlin on May 2, 1945. The soldiers who raised it had traveled approximately 1,700 kilometers from Stalingrad to reach that building. Every kilometer paid for in blood that began spilling on June 22, 1941. But before the ending is accepted, one question deserves to be held open just a moment longer, because the standard conclusion that Germany was always going to lose obscures something important about how close certain moments actually were. Here is the uncomfortable argument serious historians don't dismiss. Germany came close, not to winning the war in any complete sense, but to forcing a negotiated settlement, to fracturing the Allied coalition, to creating a stalemate that preserved the Nazi state in some form. The margin was not comfortable. It was specific. If Barbarossa had launched on May 15th as originally planned, before the Yugoslav diversion forced the 5-week delay, German forces would have reached the Moscow outskirts before the autumn mud, before the Siberian divisions arrived, before the temperature dropped below the threshold where German equipment failed and Soviet cold weather preparation became decisive. 5 weeks, held against the entire weight of the war. Historian Robert Kirchebel and others have modeled the timeline carefully. They don't claim Moscow's capture would have ended Soviet resistance. Stalin had contingency plans to retreat east. Government functions were already being relocated, but the symbolic and logistical damage of losing Moscow, the hub of the entire Soviet rail network, would have been severe enough to change the calculus of 1942 in ways that cannot be precisely predicted. This is not revisionism. It is honest uncertainty. But here is where the final twist lives. Not in the 5 weeks. Not in the logistics. Not even in Hitler's strategic errors, real as they were. The deepest reason Germany failed is that its entire war in the East was built on a category error. Germany treated the Soviet Union as a state, a conventional enemy with a center of gravity that could be struck and broken. Destroy the army. Capture the capital. Watch the government collapse and sue for peace. It was the model that had worked everywhere else. The Soviet Union was not that kind of state. It was something the German military mind had no framework to process. A system that could absorb catastrophic loss at every level: military, economic, political, human, and continue to function. Not because it was strong in the conventional sense, but because it had been constructed through decades of brutal Stalinist industrialization and political control to survive exactly this kind of pressure. The terror that made the Soviet state monstrous in peacetime made it nearly indestructible in total war. Germany's ideology told it the Soviet system was weak, racially compromised, politically hollow, one hard kick away from disintegration. The ideology was wrong, and because the ideology could not be questioned, the error could not be corrected. This is the mechanism that truly ended Germany in the East. Not weather, not one bad decision at Moscow, not Stalingrad alone, but a self-sealing system of belief that filtered out every piece of evidence contradicting its own assumptions. An army that was tactically excellent operating inside a strategic framework that was epistemically broken. German Corporal Hans Roth, who had written "Hooray" in his diary on June 19, 1941, was killed on the Eastern Front. He never came home. His diary survived him, a document that begins in certainty and ends in something that has no clean name. Millions of diaries ended the same way. On both sides, the Eastern Front killed approximately 27 million Soviet citizens, military and civilian combined. That number is so large it resists comprehension. So try it this way. If you counted one name per second, without stopping, it would take over 850 years to reach 27 million. Germany lost the East not because it was outfought in any single battle. It lost because it went to war against reality itself, the reality of Soviet scale, Soviet endurance, Soviet capacity to transform suffering into military power, armed with nothing but an ideology that told it reality would yield. Reality did not yield. The final question worth sitting with is not whether Germany could have won. The answer to that, after serious examination, is almost certainly no. The question is subtler and more unsettling. How does the most tactically sophisticated army of its era build a strategy so completely disconnected from the world it was operating in? And more pressingly, that specific failure, where institutional belief overrides observable evidence until correction becomes impossible, that failure did not die in Berlin in 1945. It has appeared again, in different uniforms, in different centuries, in organizations that were certain they understood the enemy they were about to kick. The door always looks rotten from the outside.